In 1866, the Central Pacific Railroad hit a wall. Not a wall of rock, a wall of snow. 40 feet of it. The solution would become the most extraordinary structure most Americans have never heard of. 37 miles of wooden tunnels built by hand across the Sierra Nevada to keep the trains running through the impossible. But first, people had to die. The men building America's first transcontinental railroad had already conquered things that were supposed to be unconquerable. They had blasted through granite so hard it shattered drill bits after 6 inches. They had bridged canyons that dropped 1,000 feet to rivers nobody had ever mapped. They had laid track across desert flats where summer temperatures hit 120 degrees and workers dropped dead from heat exhaustion before the noon meal. The Central Pacific had spent 3 years proving that willpower and dynamite could overcome geology. Their workers had averaged less than a mile of track per day through the California foothills, fighting terrain that seemed personally hostile to railroads. Every mile had cost money the company didn't have, borrowed against promises of future profits that seemed increasingly unlikely. But the Sierra Nevada in winter was something else entirely. The Central Pacific reached the high country in the fall of 1866, pushing toward Donner Pass at 7,042 feet elevation. The engineers knew winter was coming. They had read the reports from the handful of travelers who had crossed these mountains in cold months. They understood, in theory, what Sierra winters looked like. Theory and reality turned out to be different things. Arthur Brown was the man who would eventually solve the problem. He was the Central Pacific's superintendent of bridges and buildings, a practical engineer who thought in timber and iron rather than abstractions. Brown had built structures across difficult terrain before. He understood that mountains had moods, that weather was a variable you planned around, that engineering was the art of anticipating what nature would throw at you. But in the winter of 1866, even Arthur Brown didn't fully grasp what they were facing. The snow started falling in November, light at first, the kind of snow that California flatlanders found charming. By December, the charm had worn off. Drifts had buried the construction camps. Supply routes had become impassable. Workers who ventured out for firewood sometimes didn't come back. By January, the accumulated snowfall had reached 20 feet. By February, it kept coming. By March, it topped 40. 40 feet. Think about that for a moment. Stand on the ground and look up at a 4-story building. Now imagine that building made of snow, sitting on top of everything you've built. Your track, your equipment, your camps, your workers. The Sierra Nevada wasn't just dropping snow, it was burying an entire railroad. The workers couldn't reach the rock tunnels they were supposed to be drilling. The Summit Tunnel, the longest and most critical of the 15 tunnels through the Sierra Crest, was being attacked from both ends and from a central shaft. But the central shaft had disappeared under 30 feet of white. The tunnel entrances were accessible only by digging through drifts that reformed overnight. The track they'd already laid vanished. Locomotives that had hauled supplies up the mountains sat frozen in place, their boilers cold, their wheels locked in ice. Supply wagons couldn't get through because the roads had ceased to exist. And the avalanches had started. The Sierra Nevada doesn't just drop snow. It drops it on slopes that average 30 to 40 degrees, where it accumulates in layers that compress under their own weight. The bottom layers turn to ice. The middle layers become dense pack. The top layers stay loose and unstable. And then something shifts. A temperature change. A vibration. Sometimes nothing at all that human senses can detect. Physics takes over, and the mountain sheds its skin. Avalanches in the Sierra Nevada can move at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. They generate winds strong enough to flatten buildings that the snow itself never touches. They pick up rocks, trees, and anything else in their path and turn debris into projectiles. A man caught in one doesn't just get buried, he gets pulverized. In the winter of 1866 to 67, avalanches killed workers at Donner Pass. The exact number is disputed because the Central Pacific didn't keep careful records of Chinese laborers, who made up the overwhelming majority of the workforce. The company recorded deaths of white workers with names and dates. Chinese workers were counted in groups, if they were counted at all. Some historians say dozens died that winter. Others say the number was in the hundreds. The railroad's official reports mention the deaths in passing, the way you might mention weather delays or equipment breakdowns, an inconvenience, a cost of doing business. What we know for certain is this: crews were buried alive. Entire camps vanished overnight. Men went to sleep in wooden barracks and woke up beneath tons of snow, if they woke up at all. Bodies weren't recovered until spring, when the snow finally melted enough to reveal what it had been hiding for months. Some of those bodies were found with their hands still raised, frozen in the act of trying to dig themselves out. And here's what made it worse. The railroad couldn't stop. The Central Pacific was racing against the Union Pacific, which was building westward from Omaha across the Great Plains. Both companies received government subsidies based on miles of track completed. The Pacific Railroad Acts promised land grants and bonds for every mile laid. The company that built more track would claim more subsidies, more land, more power over the route that would connect the nation. Every day, the Central Pacific sat idle in the snow. The Union Pacific gained ground. The Union Pacific had flat terrain, minimal snowfall, and a nearly unlimited supply of Irish immigrants willing to work for low wages. They were averaging 3 to 5 miles per day, while the Central Pacific measured progress in feet. Every week of delay cost the company money it couldn't afford to lose. The Central Pacific was financed on credit, borrowing against future revenues that depended on completing the railroad. If they fell too far behind, if investors lost confidence, the whole enterprise would collapse. The directors in Sacramento faced a choice. They could accept that the Sierra Nevada was impassable from November through May, surrender half the year to winter, and watch their competitors claim the continent. Or they could find a way to keep building through the impossible. They chose impossible. The first solution was brutal and simple. If snow blocked access to the rock tunnels being drilled through the summit, the workers would tunnel through the snow to reach them. Chinese laborers dug horizontal shafts through 40 feet of packed snow, creating underground passages that connected the work camps to the tunnel faces. These snow tunnels were reinforced with timber where possible, but mostly they were just holes in frozen white, maintained by constant digging as new snow accumulated above. The workers lived and worked beneath the surface for months. They slept in caverns carved from snow. They cooked over fires that filled their underground chambers with smoke because ventilation was nearly impossible. They emerged only when absolutely necessary, and sometimes not even then. The mortality rate in those snow tunnels was catastrophic. Cave-ins were constant. The snow might seem solid for days, then collapse without warning. Men working at the tunnel faces heard the roar behind them and turned to find their escape route gone, replaced by tons of debris that might take hours or days to clear. Some didn't have hours or days. Ventilation was poor. The combination of cooking fires, body heat, and trapped air created conditions that would violate every modern safety standard. Men suffocated in their sleep. Others developed respiratory diseases that killed them slowly over months. And the avalanches didn't stop just because the workers were underground. They found the snow tunnels. They found the camps. They found the men. One account describes a work crew hearing the roar of an approaching slide and running for the tunnel entrance, trying to reach the rock cavern beyond. The avalanche caught them in the snow tunnel, collapsing it along its entire length. 20 men went in. 3 came out. The work continued because the alternative was surrender. And the Central Pacific's directors had decided, in their offices in Sacramento, where snow was a minor inconvenience, that surrender was not an option. But even this desperate measure only solved half the problem. The Central Pacific could force its way through one winter of construction. What they couldn't do was run a railroad through this every single year. A transcontinental railroad that shut down for 6 months annually wasn't a railroad. It was a seasonal attraction. No business was going to ship freight on a line that might be buried under 40 feet of snow when their cargo needed to move. No passenger was going to book travel on a route that might strand them in the mountains for weeks. The whole point of the transcontinental railroad was reliability, connection, the certainty that goods and people could move from coast to coast, regardless of season. Without that certainty, the railroad was nothing. This is where Arthur Brown earned his place in engineering history. Brown had studied the problem through the winter of 1866 to 67. While others were focused on immediate survival, Brown was observing, measuring, thinking. He watched the snow accumulate and noticed patterns. Some areas drifted heavily, while others stayed relatively clear. The wind shaped the snow as much as gravity did. He mapped where avalanches struck, tracking the paths they carved down specific chutes and gullies year after year. He measured how drifts formed around obstacles, how snow piled against vertical surfaces, how it slid off angled ones. Brown understood something that seems obvious now, but wasn't obvious then. You couldn't fight the Sierra Nevada winter. You couldn't plow through 40 feet of snow with the technology available in 1867. You couldn't post enough workers with shovels to keep 50 miles of track clear when new snow might drop 3 feet in a single night. But you could hide from it. Brown's proposal was audacious. He wanted to build a continuous wooden structure over the tracks, stretching for miles through the most dangerous sections of the route. Not bridges, not stations, tunnels. Wooden tunnels that would protect the tracks from snowfall and deflect avalanches over the trains instead of onto them. The concept wasn't entirely new. European railroads had experimented with snow galleries in the Alps, short, covered sections that protected tracks in avalanche zones. Some American railroads in New England had built wooden covers over station platforms to keep passengers dry. But nothing like what Brown was proposing had ever been attempted. He was talking about 37 miles of continuous construction, not 37 disconnected sections, 37 miles, end to end. The scale was staggering. Brown's calculations called for 65 million board feet of timber. That's enough lumber to build more than 4,000 average American homes. It would require the deforestation of entire mountainsides, harvested and milled and hauled up to 7,000 feet elevation. The ironwork alone would consume 900 tons of bolts, spikes, and reinforcing straps. Every joint, every connection, every point where timber met timber would need metal to hold it together against forces that would tear apart ordinary construction. The cost would be approximately $2 million in 1867 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere between 50 and 70 million in today's dollars. For wooden boxes over train tracks. The Central Pacific's Board of Directors listened to Brown's proposal with what surviving records suggest was considerable skepticism. $2 million was an enormous sum for a company already drowning in debt. The engineering was untested at this scale. Nobody knew if wooden structures could actually survive Sierra Nevada winters year after year. And the construction would have to happen in the same conditions that had already killed so many workers. Brown wasn't proposing to build these tunnels in some comfortable workshop and ship them to the mountains. He was proposing to build them on site, at elevation, in the snow. But the alternative was shutting down every winter, and shutting down meant losing the race, losing the subsidies, losing everything. The board approved the project. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Construction began in 1868, and here's the detail that separates this story from most engineering tales. They didn't wait for summer. Arthur Brown started building his snow tunnels in winter, while the snow was still falling, because waiting for spring meant losing another construction season. The Transcontinental Railroad was supposed to be finished by 1870. They were already behind schedule. They couldn't afford to lose 6 months sitting idle. Picture what that looked like. Workers hauling timber up a 7,000-foot mountain in snowstorms. No trucks, no helicopters, no bulldozers to clear roads. Horse-drawn wagons when the roads were passable, which wasn't often. Mule trains when the snow got too deep for horses. And human backs when nothing else worked. 65 million board feet of lumber had to reach construction sites that were often accessible only by paths cut through 20-foot drifts. Each board had to be carried, dragged, or sledged into position. Each worker had to climb to the site, work a 12-hour shift, and climb back down, often in conditions that reduced visibility to a few feet. The lumber itself came from Sierra Nevada forests, cut by company sawmills that operated around the clock when weather permitted. Trees that had grown for centuries came down in minutes, were stripped and sawn and stacked for transport. The mountains were being clear-cut to save the railroad. The iron came from foundries in San Francisco, shipped up the Sacramento River to Sacramento, then hauled over the mountains by the same brutal logistics that moved everything else. Each of those 900 tons of iron bolts had to travel the same impossible route as the lumber, the workers, the food. The workforce was primarily Chinese. By 1868, the Central Pacific employed somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Chinese laborers, and a significant portion of them were assigned to snowshed construction. These men had come to California during the gold rush, or their fathers had, chasing the same dream that drew people from all over the world. Most found that the gold was already claimed, the easy fortunes already made. What remained was work, hard work, dangerous work, work that white laborers often refused. The Central Pacific had started hiring Chinese workers in 1865, initially as an experiment. White workers had proven unreliable, prone to desertion when gold strikes or better wages beckoned elsewhere. The Chinese stayed. They worked. They didn't complain. Or if they did, nobody who mattered was listening. By 1868, Chinese laborers did the bulk of the dangerous, grinding work on the Central Pacific Line. They drilled the rock tunnels. They handled the explosives. They built the trestles and laid the track. And they built the snowsheds. These men earned roughly $30 a month, which was actually comparable to white workers' wages. But they provided their own food, which they cooked in camps that might be buried by morning. They purchased supplies from company stores at company prices. The net take-home was considerably less than it appeared. They worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that would shut down a modern construction site before the first coffee break. They built structures that engineers today still study with something approaching awe. The snowsheds weren't simple boxes over the tracks. They were engineered to survive forces that would destroy ordinary buildings. The basic design used massive timber frames, with posts sunk deep into the mountainside and beams spanning the track bed. The uphill wall, the one facing the slope where avalanches would originate, was built thick and strong, designed to resist impacts that might measure in tons per square foot. The roof angled sharply, typically at 30 to 40 degrees, so that sliding snow would deflect up and over the structure rather than crushing it. Different sections required different approaches. Ridge sheds sat atop the mountain crests where snow accumulated heavily, but avalanches were less common. These could be lighter in construction, designed primarily to shed vertical snowfall. Canyon sheds protected tracks in gullies and ravines, where water runoff concentrated in spring and avalanche debris funneled in winter. These needed to be stronger, capable of withstanding flows and impacts from above. Combination sheds handled sections where multiple threats overlapped, where a ridge transitioned into a canyon, where slopes changed angle, where the mountain's geometry created complex patterns of accumulation and release. These were the hardest to design and the most critical to get right. The joints were critical. Sierra Nevada winters don't just drop snow. They cycle between freezing and thawing, with temperature swings that can shift 50 degrees in a single day. Morning might bring sunshine, warm enough to melt surface snow. Night might drop temperatures below zero. Wood expands and contracts with these temperature changes. It absorbs moisture when snow melts, swells, then shrinks as it dries. Ice forms in cracks and pries them wider. Joints that were tight in October might be loose by February, gaping by April. Arthur Brown's designs accounted for this. The timber frames used interlocking joints that could flex without failing, moving with the natural expansion and contraction of the wood. Iron bolts reinforced critical connections, but they weren't torqued tight like modern construction. They allowed some play, some give. The whole system was designed to move with the mountain rather than fight it. A rigid structure would crack and fail. A flexible one might survive. And the scale of what they built defies casual comprehension. At peak extent, snowsheds covered approximately 37 miles of track. Some sections ran continuously for miles without a single gap. You could travel from one end to the other without seeing daylight. The lumber came from Sierra Nevada forests that would never recover in our lifetimes. Entire watersheds were stripped bare. The iron came from foundries that ran around the clock to meet demand. The labor came from men who had no other options and no way to refuse. Hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The famous Golden Spike ceremony happened at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10th. Telegraph wires carried the news across the nation. Cannons fired in San Francisco and New York. The newspapers celebrated the achievement of the age. The nation congratulated itself on conquering the continent. But up in the Sierra Nevada, the real work was just getting started. The snowsheds weren't finished when the Golden Spike was driven. They wouldn't be finished for another 4 years. The Central Pacific ran trains through the mountains, while construction continued around them, threading locomotives through wooden tunnels that were still being extended, modified, and reinforced. Workers built new sections while trains passed feet away. They hung from scaffolding while smoke and sparks billowed past. They worked in darkness much of the time because the existing sheds blocked the light and lanterns were the only illumination available. Here's something the celebratory accounts of the Transcontinental Railroad rarely mention. For passengers traveling from San Francisco to the East Coast, the most memorable part of the journey wasn't the Golden Spike or the meeting of the rails. It was the 37 miles of darkness in the Sierra Nevada. Imagine boarding a train in Sacramento, watching California's Central Valley roll past your window, the orchards and farms and small towns of a state that was finally connecting to the rest of the nation. Feel the locomotive strain as the grade increased, the cars lurching as the engine worked harder. Watch the temperature drop as you climbed, the air growing thin and sharp. Then the darkness came. The snowsheds had no windows. They couldn't have windows because windows would let in snow, which defeated the entire purpose. Some sections had small gaps between boards that allowed slivers of light to enter, but these were exceptions. When your train entered the snowshed system, daylight vanished. The world outside disappeared. What replaced it was noise. The locomotive's roar, already considerable, amplified in the wooden tunnels until it became something physical. A pressure you felt in your chest, a vibration that rattled your teeth. The confined space turned the engine's exhaust into a continuous thunder that made conversation impossible. The wheels shrieked on curves designed for mountain navigation, tight turns that the locomotive negotiated with metal screaming against metal. The sound echoed off the wooden walls and came back multiplied, layered, a cacophony that built until it seemed the whole structure must collapse from the sheer force of it. Wind howled through gaps in the timber, creating drafts that flickered the candles and lamps inside the passenger cars. The drafts carried smoke. So much smoke. Steam locomotives burned wood and coal. They generated prodigious amounts of smoke under normal conditions, which usually dispersed into open air. Inside an enclosed wooden tunnel, that smoke had nowhere to go. It accumulated. It thickened. It filled the passenger cars until visibility dropped to feet and breathing became difficult. Passengers described choking, weeping, pressing handkerchiefs to their faces for mile after mile as the train crawled through the darkness. Some stuffed cloth into the gaps around windows. Others simply endured, counting the minutes until they emerged into daylight. Contemporary accounts range from terrified to exhilarated. One passenger wrote that he felt he was descending into hell, that the smoke and noise and darkness combined into an experience of pure sensory punishment. Another described it as the greatest thrill of his life, an adventure that no other railroad in the world could offer. Almost all of them agreed that nothing else on the transcontinental journey came close. You could forget the prairies. You could forget the desert. You would never forget the 37 miles of darkness in the Sierra Nevada. The trip through the snowsheds took hours, not minutes, hours. The trains couldn't run at full speed because the grades were too steep, the curves too tight, the visibility non-existent. Even with the smoke and darkness, engineers had to navigate carefully, watching for obstacles, for debris, for sections of shed that might have shifted or failed. You sat in darkness, breathing smoke, listening to the mountain, and waiting for light that seemed like it might never come. And this was the comfortable option. The alternative was an avalanche burying you on open track. But the snowsheds had a problem that Arthur Brown had anticipated, but couldn't fully solve with the materials and technology available. Wood burns. The same locomotives that filled the tunnels with smoke also threw sparks. Hot embers from the firebox scattered behind every train, carried by the draft, landing on whatever surface they found. On open track, these sparks landed on rock or dirt or snow and sputtered out harmlessly. Inside a wooden tunnel filled with decades of accumulated soot and sawdust, they found plenty of fuel. Fires were constant. Not occasional, not seasonal. Constant. The Central Pacific established fire patrols that walked the snowsheds around the clock, every hour of every day, watching for flames. These patrols worked in shifts, usually in pairs, carrying lanterns that they had to be careful not to let become ignition sources themselves. Their job was to spot small fires before they became large ones. A spark that landed on dry timber might smolder for minutes before producing visible flame. The patrol's job was to find those smoldering spots, douse them with water or sand, and prevent them from spreading. When they failed, when a fire got ahead of them, the race began. The company positioned water barrels throughout the structures, placed at intervals that seemed reasonable on paper. But in winter, those barrels froze solid. The water you needed became a block of ice precisely when you needed it most. Workers learned to keep fires burning near the barrels to prevent freezing, which created its own risks. Sections of snowshed that took months to build could burn in hours. The dry timber, the accumulated soot, the oxygen flowing through gaps in the walls, everything combined to create conditions that fire loves. Once a blaze established itself, stopping it became nearly impossible. Some stretches of snowshed had to be rebuilt multiple times. The records show sections that burned in 1869 were rebuilt by 1870, burned again in 1871, were rebuilt by 1872. The same structures, the same locations, the same pattern of destruction and reconstruction. The company experimented with fire-resistant treatments, painting the timber with chemicals that were supposed to inhibit burning. The treatments helped marginally, but introduced new problems. Some were toxic. Others degraded the wood over time. None were effective enough to solve the fundamental issue. They tried stone sections in particularly vulnerable areas, replacing wooden walls with masonry that wouldn't burn. This worked but cost far more than timber construction. Stone snowsheds appear in the most critical locations, protecting tunnel portals and the most avalanche-prone sections. They tried design modifications that might reduce spark accumulation, adding ventilation that would carry embers away before they could land. This helped with smoke, but sometimes made fires worse by feeding them oxygen. Nothing worked perfectly. The wooden snowsheds and the fire-breathing locomotives were fundamentally incompatible, but the railroad needed both. You couldn't protect the tracks from snow without wood, because no other material was available in sufficient quantity at reasonable cost. And you couldn't move trains without fire, because steam locomotion was the only technology that worked. The company accepted the fires as a cost of operation and kept the repair crews busy. The men who walked those fire patrols deserve a mention here, though their names are mostly lost to history. They worked in shifts, day and night, in temperatures that ranged from merely cold to genuinely lethal. They walked miles of wooden tunnel with nothing but lanterns and buckets, watching for the orange glow that meant trouble. Their feet knew the planks beneath them. Their eyes learned to read smoke, to distinguish the normal haze from the different quality that meant combustion. When they found a fire, they fought it alone until help arrived, which might take hours depending on where the fire had started and how long it took for word to reach the nearest station. They beat flames with wet blankets. They threw sand and snow. They did whatever they could with whatever they had. Some of them died. The records are incomplete, but fires killed firefighters in 1870 the same way they do today. The difference was that these men had no backup, no protective equipment, no radios to call for help. Their only option when a fire got out of control was to run. And sometimes they didn't run fast enough. This was the reality of the snowshed system for its first decade of operation. A constant battle on multiple fronts. Snow trying to bury it from above. Avalanches trying to destroy it from the side. Fire trying to consume it from within. And trains running through all of it. Every day. Because the freight and passengers couldn't wait. By 1873, the snowshed system was substantially complete. 37 miles of wooden tunnel protecting the most dangerous sections of the Central Pacific's Sierra Nevada crossing. It was the largest protective railroad structure in the world, and engineering observers that contemporary observers compared to the ancient wonders. Magazines published illustrated articles about the snowsheds. Engineers from Europe traveled to study Brown's designs. The wooden tunnels became, briefly, famous. And almost immediately, people started thinking about how to make them obsolete. The snowsheds worked. That was never in dispute. They kept the trains running through winters that would have stopped any unprotected railroad. They survived avalanches that would have buried open track for weeks. They earned back their construction cost many times over in reliable operation. But they were expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and expensive to operate. The fire patrols alone cost thousands of dollars per year in wages and equipment. The lumber for repairs had to be harvested and hauled up the mountain continuously. The smoke and darkness made passenger complaints a constant issue. There had to be a better way. The better way arrived in 1884, and it was invented by a man whose name sounds made up, but wasn't. Orange Jewell was a Canadian dentist with a talent for mechanical solutions to practical problems. He had watched Rotary fans clear snow from streets in Toronto and wondered if the same principle could be applied to railroads. A spinning blade, powered by steam, that would chew through snowdrifts the way a saw chews through lumber. The first successful demonstration of Jewell's rotary snowplow happened in 1884. A locomotive fitted with a massive spinning blade at the front, 10 feet in diameter, drove into a drift and emerged on the other side. The snow that would have stopped any previous equipment simply vanished, blown clear in a fountain of white. Within a few years, rotary snowplows were clearing railroad tracks across the snow belts of North America. They could handle depths that would have stopped conventional plows. They could push through drifts in hours that would have taken shoveling crews days. They could keep track clear without needing 37 miles of wooden tunnel over it. The snowsheds didn't disappear overnight. The Central Pacific, which had merged into the Southern Pacific by this point, maintained them for decades. The investment was too large to simply abandon. But the investment in new construction stopped. Damaged sections were sometimes demolished rather than repaired. The wooden tunnels that had cost so much to build began their slow return to the mountain. By the early 1900s, significant portions of the original snowshed system had been removed. By the 1950s, most of what remained was either demolished or abandoned. The Rotary plows had won. But here's the thing. The snowsheds didn't really fail. The principle behind them is still sound, still necessary. What changed was the technology available to implement that principle. If you drive Interstate 80 over Donner Pass today, you'll see structures that look remarkably familiar. They're called snowsheds. They're made of concrete and steel, and they do exactly what Arthur Brown's wooden tunnels did: protect the road from snow that the Sierra Nevada still drops every winter. 40 feet of snow still falls. Avalanches still release. The mountain hasn't gotten any friendlier in the century and a half since Arthur Brown first studied its patterns. The modern snowsheds are shorter because plowing technology can handle the open sections. They're fireproof because internal combustion engines don't throw sparks the way steam locomotives did. They're better lit because we have electricity. They're better ventilated because we understand air quality. They meet safety standards that didn't exist in 1868. But the basic engineering is Arthur Brown's engineering. The angled roofs that deflect snow. The reinforced walls that resist avalanche impacts. The understanding that you can't fight the Sierra Nevada, but you can hide from it. 150 years later, the same solution to the same problem. Subscribe for more forgotten American history. There are ruins if you know where to look. Near Donner Summit, away from the interstate, fragments of the original snowsheds still stand. Massive timber beams gray with age, weathered to the color of old bone. Iron bolts rusted to the color of dried blood, staining the wood around them in streaks that look almost like wounds. Stone foundations that mark where the wooden walls once rose, now supporting nothing but memory. Most people drive past without noticing. The ruins aren't marked, aren't preserved, aren't maintained as historical sites. They're just there, rotting slowly in the same climate that made them necessary, being buried every winter by the same snow they were built to defeat. If you stop and walk among them, which almost nobody does, you can see the craftsmanship that went into their construction, the joints that still hold after 150 years, the iron that still grips despite the rust, the engineering that still makes sense when you understand what it was designed to resist. The men who built them are gone. The Chinese laborers who did most of the work left almost no personal records. They were recorded in company ledgers as numbers, not names. We know they came from Guangdong province, mostly. We know they sent money home to families they might never see again. We know they worked 12-hour shifts in blizzards, lived in camps that avalanches erased, and built structures that outlasted them by generations. We don't know what they thought. We don't know what they hoped. We don't know where most of them are buried, because nobody thought to record it. Arthur Brown has a slightly better historical footprint. His name appears in engineering journals and railroad company records. He's credited with the snowshed design that others copied across the Mountain West, in Colorado and Wyoming and Montana. But he never became famous the way some railroad builders did. He solved a problem, moved on to the next one, and disappeared into the same archives that hold his blueprints. This is how most American infrastructure got built, by people who solved impossible problems for modest wages, whose names were recorded in payroll ledgers and nowhere else, whose bodies sometimes ended up under the same ground their work was meant to conquer. The Transcontinental Railroad is remembered as a triumph of American engineering and American ambition. The Golden Spike ceremony gets reenacted every year. The photographs get reprinted in every textbook. The narrative of continental connection, of East meeting West, of a nation knit together by iron rails, gets told and retold until it feels like something inevitable. The snowsheds rarely make it into that narrative. They're not photogenic the way a trestle bridge is photogenic. They don't have the symbolic weight of a tunnel blasted through granite. They're just boxes, wooden boxes on a mountain, functional and unglamorous and absolutely essential. For 30 years, those boxes kept America connected. When the snow fell and the avalanches released, trains still ran. When the passes closed to wagons and pack mules, locomotives still pushed through. The snowsheds took the hit so the schedules could be kept. And then technology moved on, and the boxes came down, and the men who built them were forgotten. There's a cost to progress that rarely makes it into the celebrations. The Transcontinental Railroad opened the West to settlement, commerce, and what the textbooks used to call manifest destiny. It generated fortunes for the railroad barons, the Stanfords and Huntingtons and Crockers, whose names now grace universities and streets. It transformed San Francisco from a frontier town into a world city. It also killed people. Not just workers, though workers died by the hundreds. Chinese laborers in avalanches. Irish immigrants in construction accidents. Fire patrollers in burning tunnels. Men whose deaths were recorded as statistics when they were recorded at all. But also the Paiute and Shoshone and other nations whose lands the railroad crossed, whose hunting grounds the railroad severed, whose way of life the railroad destroyed, whose objections the railroad ignored when it acknowledged them at all. This is always true of large projects. Someone benefits and someone pays. The question is, who ends up in the photographs and who ends up in the unmarked graves? The snowsheds are interesting because they exist at the intersection of triumph and tragedy, innovation and exploitation. They represent genuine engineering brilliance. Arthur Brown really did solve a problem that seemed unsolvable. They represent American determination. The railroad really did refuse to accept defeat. They represent human endurance. The workers really did build 37 miles of structure in conditions that would stop most modern construction. And they represent the cost of all that brilliance and determination and endurance. The men who froze, the men who burned, the men who got buried and weren't found until spring, their hands still raised, still reaching for a surface they never reached. The men whose wages built fortunes for people they never met. Standing near those ruins today, if you're quiet, you can almost hear it. The wind through the timber gaps sounds like the roar of a locomotive. The creak of aging beams sounds like wheels on a curve. The snow settling sounds like the hiss of steam. And somewhere underneath the drifts, there might still be iron bolts that workers drove in 1868, holding together nothing, waiting for no one. 37 miles of wooden tunnel, built by hand, in a blizzard, on a mountain, by workers whose names we mostly don't know. That's the story of the snowsheds. That's the story of how America got built. The Sierra Nevada is still there. The snow still falls. 40 feet, just like it always has. And if you drive over Donner Pass this winter, you'll pass through concrete tunnels that look nothing like Arthur Brown's wooden walls, but work exactly the same way. Some problems don't have new solutions. They just have new materials. The snowsheds are waiting, under 40 feet of snow, where they've always been. Next time you see a highway snowshed or a concrete tunnel protecting a mountain road, remember where that idea came from. Remember that it was born in desperation, perfected in blizzards, built by hands that history forgot. 37 miles of wooden tunnel, 65 million board feet of timber, 900 tons of iron, thousands of workers whose names we'll never know. That's what it took to conquer a mountain. That's what it cost. And that's what we've been driving over, barely noticing, ever since.